Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Aaron Roberts, aka Aaron CTI. I am the founder of Perspective Intelligence, a cyber intelligence consultancy based in the United Kingdom that does open source intelligence to help businesses and individuals stay better protected online. I am delighted to be here today with Professor Sander van der Linden from the University of Cambridge, who's going to be talking to us about misinformation in the wake of the upcoming US election next week. I am super excited about this talk. I think it's going to be really fascinating. I'm going to hand straight over to Sander to take it away. Good morning, Sander.
Good morning, and thanks so much for having me. Excited to talk to the open source intelligence community about misinformation. Usually when I give this talk, it's interesting because I do a little quiz, and I love the fact of having expert audiences to see how well they do. So maybe when people are watching this later, people can sort of do it in their own head. But so all of these stories are widely reported. Two of them are fake. The question is which one's true. So A is Putin issues international arrest warrant for George Soros. B is a baby born in California was named Hard Eyes Emoji. And C, criminal farts so loudly he gives away his hiding place. And so it's interesting because when I do this, most people actually say B because they think that people in California would do that. It's interesting because when I give this talk in California, people in California also think that the answer is B. And some people go with C. It sounds too ridiculous to be true, but in fact, this was true. This was um, a guy in Missouri, I believe, in the sheriff's department tweeted hashtag when you're having a shit day. But he did. He was hiding in the bushes and passed gas so loudly he gave away his own hiding place. I mean, it's too ridiculous to be true. And enough of the fart jokes. But I think the point is actually that this primed us to think more about how do people discern misinformation and what are some of the abilities that we need. And it dawned on us actually that there's no formal test instrument as we have in other areas of psychology like personality science or mental health where there are diagnostic sort of assessments. And so we actually created what we call the misinformation susceptibility test over a number of years, which was validated over the course of a number of years. This is free. Anyone can take it. YouGov uses it now. This is a psychometrically validated test that gives people headlines, 20 of them, and we've used IRT, which is item response theory, to try to scale this according to various difficulty levels. And you get a score in terms of how gullible you are versus how skeptical versus, whether you give patterns of just distrusting everything versus being naive. And so it's also a research tool that people can use. It's called the MIST. And, of course, stuff differs across cultures and there's always, it's not the same as a stable psychological trait. I mean, we're talking about news headlines, but surprisingly, this thing's actually pretty stable in terms of benchmarking. So we've benchmarked this across the UK and the US populations. We're trying to find out how you could do this in other cultures because it's not just a simple matter of translation because news media are just very different in different parts of the world. So that's a bit more tricky, but we're working on it, but it's a useful instrument to have. And I'll come back to the importance of that in a second. I mean, I don't have to tell this community, of course, some of the consequences we've seen. For example, during the pandemic, phone masts were set on fire in the UK because of false 5G conspiracies. Not just a Western phenomena, right? In Iran, people were hospitalized because they were drinking methanol because they read on social media that it would cure the virus. Just recently in the UK, we've seen violent riots based on misinformation about the assailant being a MI5 listed asylum seeker, which was totally false. And of course, it's a complex issue. People already have resentments towards minority groups and opinions about immigration that sort of plays into all of this. But the source of the um, riots in this case was a false story on social media that provided the fuel for the fire. Of course, in the US, we've got apparently Haitians eating cats and dogs. And the interesting thing to me, and I'll talk a bit more about this, is that I know that fact checkers and others, it's important to get to the bottom of things about specific claims. And in this case, this was false because the Haitian community, wasn't eating cats or dogs. Um, but you can find some instance of some human eating a cat somewhere in the world. And so the question is, what is the purpose of these narratives, even if there is some vague truth at some point in time about some story, right? Clearly, this particular claim was false, but then people will say, oh, but it's symbolic of this sort of larger issue. And it's actually interesting because if you trace back the eating cats and dogs narrative, you actually go to the sort of historical propaganda about immigrants. That's actually a very common theme, to suggest that immigrants are eating pets, which is actually a repeated narrative. And that's what kind of my interest is in the psychology of propaganda, and how sort of these narratives are repeated throughout history and how we can anticipate them. Of course, we had lots of fake news about Russia, Ukraine, invading Ukraine to target Nazis. This was all absurd. The Capitol riots, Hamas and Israel conflict, lots of manipulated videos, imagery. And again, here, obviously open source community is extremely valuable in identifying which images are real, which are fake, reverse image search, all of these things. People are massively confused about these things. But coming back to my point, actually, what's interesting is that the same images from Arma 3, which is a video game, right? They're often used in violent conflict to dupe people, first-person shooter game images. But the same ones that were used in Russia, Ukraine during the conflict were used in the Israel-Hamas conflict. And again, that's of interest to me because it was entirely predictable that they would use certain tactics. And the failure to anticipate some of these repeated techniques of misinformation is what really intrigues me. As a psychologist, I don't specialize in fact checking specific claims. I leave that to the expert communities. But I'm interested in the psychology of these sort of larger propaganda techniques. And here's another great example. Of course, you had COVID. mRNA vaccine is new. It's going to change your DNA. People thought this was very plausible because it is a new vaccine. It has unexpected effects maybe on your body. Nobody knows. And sure, you can have legitimate questions about new science. But what I always tell people is that if you go back to the first vaccine, which was Edward Jenner's cowpox vaccine against smallpox in the 1800s, what's fascinating is that the anti-vax community, which emerged at the same time as vaccine advocates, they came up with these horrifying paintings and images of humans with udders sprouting out of people's mouths and morphing into a cow. So here's an example where you can see the cow humans emerging. And the idea was that if you took the cowpox vaccine, you would turn into a cow or a human cow hybrid, which is the exact same story that they were floating now, just in the context of COVID. So it's actually, again, the same technique 200 years later, but somehow we've not caught on. And sometimes I think we can get lost in sort of checking specific details rather than the meta sort of techniques. And I think both are valuable, but I am particularly intrigued in tackling these larger narratives. Okay, so what is misinformation? Everybody asks me this, and the funny answer, or maybe not so funny, is that or Elon Musk's answer is that misinformation is whatever information you don't agree with, which I think is really problematic because it points to the politicization of this issue. Misinformation, in terms of how we define it, is misinformation. It's either false or misleading. But I think it's a really important distinction, because if you look at the amount of content that's overtly false and fabricated, that's actually pretty small in terms of the slice. People sometimes say, oh, misinformation isn't that big of a problem. But that is based on a very select and narrow definition of stuff that's purely, the earth is flat type stuff. Yeah, I mean, it's true that a minority of people believe that, and that's not huge. But it also includes misleading information, which is information that has some kind of grain of truth, but is otherwise deceptive. And that is actually a huge problem. That, scales the percentage to really a significant portion of people's media diet. And so disinformation is then misinformation with some psychological intention to deceive or harm other people intentionally. So intentional misinformation. And propaganda is disinformation in the service of a political or commercial agenda. Doesn't have to be institutionalized. And so fake news is such a meaningless term now that I try to prefer to be specific. And of course, I'm most interested in disinformation and propaganda, but it can be difficult to sort of pin down legally, intent in these situations. So I was I shared a consensus statement on this definition, at least for my field. And but this definition we came up with was actually, I'm more interested in the extent to which a headline shows evidence of manipulation, regardless of the source or the intent, or whether it's been fact-checked or not. And that's for a variety of reasons, which I'll come back to in a second. But the broadest way in which we define information to be as inclusive as possible is information that's demonstrably false or otherwise misleading. Um, and of course, people are, how do you know something is false, right? Well, we know we can do that through fact checking and expert or scientific consensus or identifying characteristics of epistemologically dubious content, lack of context, presenting opinion as fact, logical fallacies, manipulation. There's 2,000 years of history of documenting these things.
Do you
And
think
actually, if you look
clickbait
at,
is like a cause of this as well?
yes, yeah. I think clickbait is part of the problem, which is a technique, right, that is used to manipulate people. And so I think clickbait content sometimes has some element of truth, but is otherwise misleading. Yeah, so if you look at some of the science on this, you actually see, and this was a study that was published in Science recently, that the impact of fact-checked misinformation, the sort of narrow stuff that's obviously false, was 50 times less than of content not flagged by fact checkers, but nonetheless expressed, in this case, vaccine skepticism, sort of subtle type of misinformation, in terms of measuring its impact on vaccine hesitancy. And so that's quite a big differential. So it actually shows that the subtle type of manipulation is the trickier bit to address. And so how do people do this in the field? The one approach is to look at fake news URLs, which, basically relying on fact-checked articles like Snopes or PolitiFact, and that's how we determine, which story is true, which story is false, which is fine. But that deals with the obviously fake stuff, right? Other people look at sources. So there's lists of producers of unreliable content, and so this is a heuristic, right? That if the source is dodgy, then the content is most likely dodgy. But both of these approaches have some limitations. I mean, most news isn't fact-checked, so that's a big limitation. And the other is that sometimes credible sources also publish dodgy content. You mentioned clickbait before, and so I think we miss out on some important things if we follow these sort of standard approaches. So that's why we sort of focus on the presence or absence of misinformation techniques. So I'm not interested so much in is this true or false, but we want to calibrate people's accuracy judgments as a function of manipulation more generally. So here's the example of a fake story. Vitamin C protects against coronavirus. I mean, this is totally fact-checked as false. Health Impact News, also a fake news website. So that's easy. But this one, and this is an example of the study that I just showed you. The Chicago Tribune is a Pulitzer Prize winning outlet in the US. Healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting COVID vaccine. CDC is investigating why. I mean, this wasn't fact-checked because technically it's true. A healthy doctor did die 2 weeks after getting the COVID vaccine, except one had nothing to do with the other. But it's framed as if the doctor died because of the vaccine, right? Which is a correlation causation fallacy and a framing technique used to influence and manipulate people. And that's why we would rate this as manipulative. And we want to educate people about these techniques because this headline specifically was one of the most viewed stories on Facebook in 2021 and did much more damage than any outright fake news story. And then, once you get broader, you start noticing all sorts of things, right? There's a study, socioeconomic position and the risk of brain tumor, a Swedish national population-based cohort study, very, very technical. And then there's a press release from the journal, higher levels of education linked to heightened brain tumor risk. And then we get the Daily Mail Mirror, why going to university increases risk of getting a brain tumor. And so at this point, the science becomes misinformation. And so it's interesting that some people complain that when you go broad, everything is all of a sudden misinformation. But I think, unfortunately, actually, yeah, it's hard to be accurate, even about science. And we should try to hold people to high standards, I think. And so making a hard pivot now. So this is an image of Madrid. There's tons of people in Madrid, a huge city, the most populous city in Europe, 3.5 million people. Here's the flag of Spain, lots of people in Madrid, tons of people, most populous city in Europe. You can see it growing here, really fast growth. It's a huge, huge city. And so psychologically, one of the issues that we have to deal with, if I now tell you that was complete nonsense, Madrid isn't the most populous city in Europe. something interesting happens in the brain, which is that now you have to tag something I previously said as false, and all things go wrong when we try to do that.
That's thrown me a little bit.
And
As you were saying, I was like, is it? Surely not.
exactly. And now people start. Sure. Um, in fact, it used to be London, but then there was this little exit thing, and now it's actually. I actually think it's. I don't want to spread misinformation now, but Berlin is possibly the biggest. The biggest. Madrid is in the top, but it's not. It's not the most populous. Um, so. Yeah, so the issue is that corrections are tough because of the way that memory works. And when you try to debunk something or fact check it after the fact, people have to tag their memory with a cue saying something is false after they've already integrated it into their mental model of how something works. So if the next time you're on a game show and they ask about the most popular city in Europe and the first thing that comes to mind is Madrid, don't blame me. But the idea, and in fact, illusory truth is the phenomena that the more you repeat something, the more likely you are to think it's true because the brain uses fluency or the speed with which you can process information as an indicator for truth. So the more you say something, the easier it becomes to process, the more likely we are to think something is true. That's why politicians and liars keep repeating their lies because they know that it's effective, and people over time start to think that there must be something to it. Now, when you try to correct, some interesting neurological evidence which shows that there's really two competing accounts. One is people fail to integrate the correction into their mental model, which is an integration error. That can be because the correction is too complex, it's too sciencey, it's too long compared to the misinformation. Or it could be that it doesn't resonate with people politically, and the misinformation did. And so there's all sorts of challenges. There could also be a retrieval error. So when you try to activate information, we kind of activate misinformation and accurate information concurrently in your memory, and you try to suppress the false information. But lots of things can go wrong with suppression when you try to retrieve it. And so for all of these reasons, this is a meta-analysis which is not very optimistic about corrections, estimating on average a null effect of debunking. Sorry, should say I'm recovering from a cold here. The There's a lot of heterogeneity, in this meta-analysis. So if you do debunking right, if you make sure that the correction resonates with people, doesn't, isn't too complex, isn't too long, people can digest it easily. It provides an alternative explanation, because that's one of the biggest things of why corrections don't work, is if you say something is false, then people don't know what's true instead. So there's a gap, and this gap is super uncomfortable for people. And so they just revert back to what they thought was true. So you have to provide people with an alternative that they can digest easily, not an alternative that's cognitively overwhelming. So if you do all of that right, then you can partially reduce the impact of misinformation. And so here you have these sort of two modes, the retrieval error and the integration error. And this also has to do with repetition. You're always in a bad spot in a way when you try to correct things after the fact, because now you have to repeat the falsehood that somebody else spread, and you have to say it's not true because so and so, and this is what's true instead. So you always run the risk of repeating the falsehood and strengthening people's familiarity with it if you don't end up making the correction overwhelmingly prominent, because that's what you need to do for a successful correction, is the misinformation should be minimized. And then so for all these reasons, we've tried to focus on the idea of prebunking, or the opposite of debunking, which is to try to preemptively build resilience to people. And that's a slightly weird concept to people who've never heard that before. But the idea is that it follows the inoculation metaphor or the vaccine metaphor pretty much exactly. So just as administering a weakened dose of a virus triggers the production of antibodies to help confer resistance against future infection, turns out you can do the same with misinformation. Instead of fact checking or giving people facts, what you actually do is you give people a weakened dose of the misinformation, and you refute that misinformation in advance with the techniques that are used to produce misinformation, so that people can build cognitive antibodies over time. And you can measure those antibodies. How well can people identify manipulation? How motivated are they to counter argue falsehoods? How readily are they to be able to resist attempts to persuade them with myths? And so you can measure all of that. And so we know that this resistance, like a vaccine, develops over time. And the psychological process also includes a warning. So warnings are not great on their own. If you just warn people about deepfakes and fake news, then people start becoming skeptical of everything, which is not what we want. You also have to give people the ability to actually differentiate, and that's what the inoculation or the prebunk or the refutational preemption in the literature, as it's called, that's what that does. And so that's important to include. So it's not just about warning people, and it's also not just about exposing people to a weakened dose of a falsehood. That's not the idea. You want to refute it or deconstruct it for people at the same time, because you don't want to run the risk of accidentally giving people the virus, quote unquote. So when we did this in the lab, we get people to the lab and, we expose them to a pre-bunk, and then we give them the internet and they can browse some falsehoods, and then we find that they became more resistant to it. We got a lot of interesting news headlines. Cambridge scientists consider fake news vaccine. It's possible to vaccinate Americans specifically because we used a US population. People were excited. But we did have a problem of this was a theory in the lab, and how do you go out and actually do this thing in the real world, and how is this useful to practitioners? So one of the things we did as scientists, trying to be creative, we actually came up with a game. And I should say, obviously, um, J.K. Rowling is becoming more and more politicized as a figure, but this is my ode to the defense against the dark arts teacher, Professor Snape, who was a wonderful actor. I was a big fan. So this is my ode to this character specifically because he said something really important um, in the book, in the novel, is that your defenses must be as flexible and inventive as the arts that you seek to undo. And I think that's really key because our defenses haven't evolved in a long time. We just stick to checking the facts. But actually, as lies are evolving, and we have cheap fakes, we have deep fakes, we have AI, we need to be flexible in how we protect people as well. We need to find new ways of doing that, and that's kind of what inspired. But what I found inspiring about this is that if I remember in my own childhood watching some Harry Potter movies, they actually had to, with the dark arts, that was a dangerous class because you had to jump in and actually deal with it in order to understand how to defeat it. And it's kind of the same with misinformation. We find people need the experience of actually fighting it, and that's what we tried to emulate. And I'm not sure what Alan Rickman would think about it, but we came up with a game. We call it Bad News. Bad News is a pun. It was supposed to be sarcastic, supposed to be fun. We didn't want to brand it as some elitist attempt to tell people what to believe. And in fact, it is a simulation. It's a fake news game. It was the first fake news game at the time. It's a simulation. And the goal is to gain as many followers as possible without losing any credibility by making use of weakened doses of some of the general tricks that are used to dupe people online. And then we also show people how to deconstruct it in the process. And this was during the previous Trump presidency. After long deliberation with my generals, have decided to declare war on North Korea, hashtag Kim Jong-un. This is not something Trump said, but maybe could have said. And it's, for political balance, here we have Joe Biden as your president. I've issued an executive order to rename Canada to North Dakota, hashtag you got annexed. And the idea really is that people need to spot a trick here, which is most people actually don't spot the N instead of the M. So this is a manipulated Twitter handle, and it's the same for Joe Biden. And this is part of what we call the impersonation technique, which we spent a few years. So journalists, say, okay, vaccination, great, but don't you have the same problem as with fact checking, that how does this scale? You can't sort of pre-bunk every single falsehood. And so we spent a few years trying to uncover the general techniques that are used by producers of misinformation, including talking to people who worked in Russian troll farms and all of that. And so we uncovered some, not all, but some that we thought were useful. And impersonation is one, impersonating doctors, impersonating celebrities, fake accounts, official institutions. So you tweet this. So this is an interactive thing, right? Mainstream media, one massive conspiracy, hashtag fake news. Here, impersonating NASA, meteorite. You start your own hashtag, be safe. So people respond. you get followers. Yeah, if you're being too ridiculous, you lose credibility because that's not what a clever manipulator would do. Um, and so here are some of the techniques, polarizing people, creating us versus them headlines and mentalities. Already talked about impersonation, conspiratorial thinking, showing that, you know, most what we try to do here, again, is not go into the history of every possible conspiracy, but show a pattern of kind of defunct conspiratorial thinking that is inherently unscientific and how that process sort of works. Regardless of whether a specific one could be true or not, it's more about, recognizing the hallmarks of the fact that every conspiracy almost follows the same rule book. It's a playbook. There's somebody plotting behind the scenes. It's an evil actor. And you can group them by themes. Oh, Tupac Shakur is still alive. All these celebrities are still alive somewhere. Avril Lavigne is a clone. It's always the same thing reincarnated. Princess Diana is still alive. And so in fact, we've done experiments where we ask people to use these building blocks. There's a persecuted victim, reinterpret randomness in terms of a causal pattern, overriding suspicion, don't trust anything. And using those building blocks, you can come up with most conspiracies that actually parallel a lot of the ones in the real world. Trolling, which is huge during elections. Cat Turd, for example, on Twitter, one of the biggest trolls during US elections. I'm not sure if you know this account, but Cat Turd frequently boosted by Musk and others who basically just trolls people on Twitter. The use of emotions to manipulate, fear mongering, things like that, and discrediting official fact checkers, open source intelligence community folks. Anyone who's mainstream and an official institution. So those are not all, but those are some of the techniques we were covering. It was all fictional, right? So we want to be ethical. So, we don't want to actually dupe people, but it's based on reality. Somebody impersonated Warren Buffett on Twitter. Again, you can see there's a T missing here. Hundreds of thousands of followers within minutes, with random advice. Oh, invest in what makes you happy. And so we decided to test this with John Rosenbeek, who was my co-author and colleague. This thing went viral on Reddit randomly. And so they gave us what they call the Reddit hug of death, which is where they crashed our servers because there were the people playing it and they thought, this is fun. A lot of comments about, oh yeah, it's kind of like video games where you step into the shoes of the character you're trying to defeat and you learn their tricks. And so, people were digging it. But it was also a scientific opportunity. And so we had a pre-post test of items that kind of use simulated Twitter items that either use or don't use the techniques that are featured in the game. And we had about 30,000 responses. Very simple pre-post design. This thing went viral. A couple of months, we had 15,000 people, which is so much bigger than we could ever do in the lab, getting 10 students at a time, for example. And so this light gray bar is before, the darker gray bars are after. This is credible content that doesn't use any manipulation. People find highly reliable before and after playing. But for the impersonation, conspiracy, deflection techniques, people find items that use those techniques significantly less reliable. These are medians. This is the whole data distribution. This is the quartile range around the median. So you can see people start at different levels if you're left, conservative, young, old, lower, higher educated. But the intervention effect, which is the difference between pre-post, is pretty similar across different groups. So yeah, people start off with different susceptibilities, but everyone's learning or being protected in a way. Of course, this was a very simple design. It wasn't controlled, a few items. So maybe we just got lucky with some easy items. So we did another randomized study with 18 items, 6 items, or 3 items per technique. There's 6 techniques, so that's 18 items people rate. We had a control group that also played a game unrelated to fake news to have proper controls. And again, you see here that people find in the placebo group nothing is happening, so 0 improvement. The average hovers around 0. The dots are the data points. In the inoculation group, people find fake news significantly less reliable. So it's shifting to the left, the density, which means less reliable, which is what we want. My student Melissa had a hypothesis about confidence too, because if you're not very confident in your own abilities, you're easily persuaded by bad actors. So we actually found that the game was boosting people's confidence in their own abilities too. And after we'd done many of these experiments, we started wondering, how long does it last? And is there some analogy here to vaccines again about maybe people need some booster shots over time? And so I'll walk you through the setup once more because they're all the same. So I'm not going to bore you with the experimental design of every study we've ever done, but they're pretty similar. So we randomize people to the game or a placebo group who plays Tetris for 20 minutes. So yes, we got comments from people asking if this was a joke, whether we're paying them to play Tetris for 20 minutes. But indeed, if you were part of the control group, lucky you. And so Tetris, because it's open source, so it was an easy thing to do. So we randomize people to inoculation control. They first do the pre-test, right? So they come in, they do our 18-item fake news test, then randomized inoculation control. But then this has been nefarious, called in the literature the attack phase. So we attack people with misinformation week after week after week after week to see how long the effect lasts, how long people's resistance lasts. Second experiment, we do the same thing, except we only come at the end, after a few months, we knock on people's door and we say, hey, how's it going? What do you think about this fake news? And nothing in between. And in the third one, we mix up the items because our items are always the same. So I guess you could argue people could memorize their answers. So we switch up the items in the third experiment. So basically what you find is this, and all of this is open science, so it's data is available. People can play around with it on the open science framework. So here you go. So people found fake news less reliable after playing, so shifting to the left. But then it stayed that way for 3 months. So I said to Raccoon, was my student at the time, I said, I mean, that's not really possible. I mean, if we were to declare a vaccine that doesn't lose immunity over time, it seems, from a psychological sense, doesn't seem plausible. And so we did it again. And this is where we don't follow up with people, only at the end. So again, it works. But then you see people start finding fake news more reliable again. So there's still a difference between treatment and control in that it works, but there's about a decay of 50% after a while. And that actually got us thinking, and we have a new paper forthcoming soon where we look at this, is that actually what happened was if you regularly ping people and you ask them to rate misinformation, you're actually boosting them in a way because later, we actually found out why does the effect decay, and we know that exponential decay does set in after about a week. It has two processes. One has to do with memory, the other has to do with motivation. People lose motivation, and also they forget what they're supposed to look out for. So giving people a quiz actually boosts their memory and their motivation. And later we found it doesn't have to be a quiz. It could be re-exposing people to the game, just 5 minutes. It could be a little slideshow. It could be a video. It can be anything. But people do need to be boosted. So after this, my kind of wrap it up soon. I want to do some election stuff and then wrap it up. The Foreign Office in the UK got in touch saying they wanted to help us promote media literacy around the world. So they helped translate this intervention into every major language so we could do large-scale cross-cultural studies. We did one in Russian, and during the war, we have one in Hebrew that we did during the conflict. So we can respond rapidly with new versions. What I like about games, people say, okay, but not everyone wants to play a game, which is true. There's a biased demographic. Men are slightly more interested in playing a bad guy game, for example, than women. So we've tried to diversify perspectives, appeal to younger versus older audiences. We've tried to do a lot to make these games appealing to a wider audience. But at the end of the day, it's true. Not everyone wants to play a game. But people have done this in India. They've tried to replicate this in India, finding very similar results. It does matter a lot if you're urban versus rural. So we find that in Brazil, India, if you're in urban populations where people have some familiarity with memes and English language and social media, this works. But if you go into rural areas, people don't know what's going on because I think the literacy is just so different. And people are not used to using social media in the way that we use it. And our games use a lot of sarcasm and humor and knowledge of memes and stuff like that. So we really, have to adapt this to different cultures. There's been meta-analyses at this point of this literature, finding that it helps people discern better between manipulation and non-manipulation. We've had a version for kids that's more age appropriate, fake news about SpongeBob, impersonating the high school principal at School's Out or the headmaster. And I'm not going into all of these games, but we started getting requests to do this in an official capacity. So we did one with the UK government and the World Health Organization and the United Nations during the start of the pandemic. It was called Go Viral. It had to be much shorter because they said, okay, the bad news was a fun science experiment, but people are not going to play a 20-minute game on social media. So we created a 5-minute version that just focused on impersonating, fake doctors and conspiracies about the 5G and microchips in the vaccines and emotional manipulation, fear mongering about vaccines and that kind of stuff. And we were lucky because being part of the UN and the WHO became a popular page on the WHO website. It works the same as bad news. It was the start of the pandemic. Oh, how I need a quarantini. Global NGOs covering up that eating kiwis actually cures the virus, and you become a part of this group called Not Co-Afraid. And there's the lizard people are behind coronavirus, and so you learn about fake experts and. Again, it went viral, and we were able to reach 200 million people with this campaign at the start of the pandemic. So it was meant to be preemptive, right? Inoculate people against these common tactics that we're going to see throughout the pandemic. And we did randomized controlled trials in different countries showing that this works and that people become more motivated than just looking at text, and that they're more likely to share this than the traditional types of things that the UN and the WHO were doing. We did one during the previous election with CISA, which is the Cyber Security and Infrastructure Agency in the US, the Department of Homeland Security, about foreign interference, which is very relevant, of course, to what we're talking about today with regards to elections. So Chris Krebs, who was fired by Trump for repeatedly debunking his claims that the election was fraudulent, came up with this pineapple pizza metaphor that we thought was great. So the goal of this intervention was to explain foreign interference to audiences and to help secure the integrity of elections. And so inoculation is great when you can break down a playbook. And so we thought, what is the playbook of foreign interference? And Chris came up with pineapple pizza. You can't see it on the photo, but he's actually eating a pizza. And the idea here is that there's a few steps. You look for an issue that you can divide people on. Let's say, should you put pineapple on pizza? And then you'll say, no, that's going to offend the Italians. That's cultural appropriation. Very bad. And then you have the other people who say, nobody is going to interfere with my pizza topping freedom. This is a free country. I'm going to do what I want. And then you move accounts into place, you buy bots, you amplify both sides of the debate, and you cause chaos and confusion, which then sort of escalates maybe to even offline violence. And of course, they don't do this with pineapple pizza, but they do this with abortion, immigration, race issues, right? You target an issue, you blow up both sides, false amplification. And so that's what Harmony Square was about. Of course, again, in weakened form, so you have an election caster guy who's giving you real-time approval ratings as you're mounting a disinformation campaign about a political candidate. Ashley Plug is running for bear patroller, even though there are no bears in Harmony Square, but they just love democracy so much that they want to have elections all the time. And again, it's supposed to be sarcastic, and you think you come up with a story that Plug was abusing animals in college, and you start floating memes that her animal abuse is unbearable. And so it sort of escalates from there. But then we test people with real stuff on social media, right? Real headlines that are polarizing. This really happened, that a man and his 9-year-old daughter were killed by a hunter who mistook them for a deer. Somebody commented 1.5 less MAGA Billies in the world. At least they died supporting their beloved Second Amendment. Polarizing issues, real stuff. So we don't want to, is this true or not? We just want to alert people to polarizing debates from no matter where it's coming from. And so again, people find this stuff less reliable after playing versus being in the control group. They were more confident and less willing to share this type of stuff with others. And this was rolled out during the election to help people spot foreign interference. And in the last phase, Google approached us and said, we want to help you guys But again, this game issue, it's voluntary, it's opt-in, right? And this is a big problem. And so they said, what if we do videos? Um, and we thought that was interesting. So they said, we own YouTube. And so what if, we do animated videos? And those annoying ads that you can't skip on YouTube? What if we launch the prebunks there before people are, potentially exposed to misinformation? Um, then we could make that mandatory, and you could scale that across billions of people, across the whole platform, and that would instantly scale this prebunking idea without the sort of critique that you have to have people who want to play the game, who want to opt in, who are curious. So we thought this was a great idea. And so we created videos with them using the inoculation script. So it's basically a script, right? So you may be targeted on this platform, you have to be aware. Here's a micro dose of the types of manipulation techniques you can see, for example, scapegoating minority groups, and then some microdose examples of what that looks like on the YouTube channels. And then we give people a video that follows that script. And then we test them. So I'm not going to go through all of the 6 randomized trials that we did looking at some of these techniques. And so these are different techniques because YouTube is not a news organization. They have political gurus who try to influence people using different types of techniques. So, for example, manipulative language like floating false dichotomies, scapegoating groups, ad hominem attacks rather than focusing on facts. And especially during elections, all of these gurus come out of their channels, and they try to influence people to vote one way or the other with manipulative rhetoric, and so we want to make people aware of that type of rhetoric. So again, control inoculation by 1 minute video to minute and a half. Then we show people either manipulative social media posts or its neutral version. And then the key thing is if people are better at discerning following the inoculation. So I won't play this now, but what's the video? What does it look like? So for example, on false dilemmas, which is a technique that's often used by manipulators and misinformation producers, is the idea that you give people 2 options, while in fact there's more, right? So you take away all nuance to breed extremist thinking. And what's a weakened dose? I mean, Google didn't like the idea, neither did most social media companies at the time, of synthesizing a weakened dose from actual misinformation. So they wanted us to neutralize the whole thing, like almost like an inactive vaccine, not a live vaccine, but an inactive one, so that there was no risk of criticism on their part, and supposedly getting complaints, I presume. But so we had to be creative. So actually, we turned towards popular culture, and so we found a clip from Star Wars, Revenge of the Sith. I'm not sure if people are familiar with Star Wars, but Revenge of the Sith. There's a clip, kind of a climactic episode between Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, and a spoiler alert. Basically Obi-Wan is talking to Anakin Skywalker, who goes on to become Darth Vader, and Darth Vader says, either you're with me or you're my enemy. And then Obi-Wan says, only a Sith deals in absolutes. And then the narrator kind of goes like, don't join the dark side. Don't use these type of manipulation techniques. And that's the weakened dose, right? That's completely sterile, but people get the joke in a non-partisan way. Like, this is a false dilemma. It's not either you're with me or you're my enemy. And then we test people with actual stuff, like stuff you find on social media. Why give illegal immigrants access to social services when we should be helping homeless Americans instead? You often see this during political debates too. I mean, this is the neutral version reads, why can't we help illegal immigrants and homeless Americans? I mean, sure, resources are finite, but most of these things are kind of a false choice. And if you're pro this, then you're anti that, or if after a mass shooting, you often see the gun federations. They say something like, if you're not pro automatic rifles, you're anti the Second Amendment or something like that. Right, and those are all examples of false dilemmas. But then, this worked in the lab, and I can show you this here. For all of these videos, these are effects of more manipulative, less trustworthy, less willing to share. And these effects were quite big, actually, in psychological terms. But then we wanted to do this in the field. So we actually, after years of negotiating, we got YouTube to allow us to actually test this on YouTube in the ad spaces. And you know those questions you get on YouTube, we hijacked that corporate sort of brand lift for the purpose of scientific evaluation of the experiment. And so people basically got about 1 million views on a campaign. So either it was the video or control video about freezer burn, and then 30% were randomly selected for a survey question within 24 hours of being exposed to the video. So it was randomized in the campaign for 30% of the total campaign. So it was about 20,000 people. That was about 30% of the total campaign exposure, and so it was pretty large. And then it wasn't immediate, right? There was a 24-hour delay between the test question and the pre-bunk video. And, you know, the effects are more modest. So we boosted people by 5 to 10%. But, you know, you have to take into account that companies, they pay millions for a 1% increase in brand recognition on YouTube, right? Because they know a 1% increase in brand recognition leads to X% of sales. So 10% is actually large for what YouTube would consider a successful brand lift on an ad when people are distracted on social media. So this wasn't all bad in the sense of the size of the effect. It was smaller than we see as scientists in the lab, but they were optimistic. And in fact, Google's rolled this out. In Germany, they did a huge campaign reaching, you know, using decontextualization, fear-mongering, whataboutism as the techniques. Very similar results. They were able to reach about half of the online German population. So we're talking, you know, millions and millions of people using these video pre-bunks. They did the same during the EU elections. They won't be doing the same for the US election. And that's because the concept of misinformation is so politicized, and that's a huge downside, I think, of working with social media companies is that you know, when they're doing the right thing, they're doing the right thing. When they're not, they're not, and you have no influence on when they're leading. The research teams are great. They're honest people trying to fix this problem, but people at the top, they're influenced by other things than accuracy, right? And so they didn't want to do anything during the U.S. Election, not even help educate people about common manipulation techniques. We've put out manuals, guides, how to do this step by step for people who are interested. We have a handbook with Google and the BBC, for example, on the Prebunking handbook on how you run these campaigns. We just put out a paper, Prebunking election rumors using AI. One of the things that we're trying to do is scale this approach in different ways. So we use an LLM to create prebunks based on the most common voter manipulation myths from the last election. These were also drawn from CISA. So these are things like this, you know, voter fraud, dead people voting, right? Voter rolls have registrants that are 105 years old. Dominion voting system questions. Software is not properly updated. Voting by mail isn't safe. So the common election myths that you see during an election that are extremely unlikely to be true, and as past court rulings have indicated, have usually no basis.
Yeah.
We asked the LLM to design prebunks, and it did that really well. It knows inoculation, it knows how to structure it and how to write it. And we had a really large sample of a national sample of U.S. voters, and actually we found that prebunking, you know, later in the experiment, we exposed voters to the actual misinformation articles, but we had inoculated them before. And you can see here, this is the pre-treatment confidence in the assigned election rumor. You can see that in the treatment group, there's the red line. You know, people have less confidence in the rumor, and of course, it sort of even goes negative here, which is so this is the change in the assigned election rumor confidence. This line is placebo. But as you can see, it's the same pattern for independents and Republicans. And in fact, we found that this approach is non-political. It works for all audiences. You know, we calculated that you'd be able to inoculate millions of Americans at this rate against election rumors during this election in the few weeks that we have left. It was used by Biden against Putin. One of the most famous prebunks was prebunking the invasion of Ukraine. So the U.S. administration prebunked together with the UK the fake videos that Putin released, saying that there were Ukrainian soldiers on Russian soil as a pretext for the invasion. They deconstructed that video, told people this is why it's fake, this is why he's trying to start a war, which actually delayed the attack. So that was another example of a pre-bunk, kind of deconstructing the deep fake or the cheap fake in this case. So they've used that on Russia. It's now part of the DSA for very large online platforms. Whether it's they don't say how you should pre-bunk, but they should be doing something. If you want more propaganda, totally biased, manipulative book, this is some of my writing. And thanks so much. I'll end it there and happy to take any questions.
That is fascinating.
It was a bit long, but a bit longer than I anticipated. But hopefully, we have some time for questions.
Sure, for sure. Firstly, thank you. That was really, really interesting, and I think seeing like you work through those processes and understanding, like, you can do these small little pieces of like work to then understand. I questioned that. Like earlier when you said Madrid is the most popular city in Europe, I was like, in my head, I was like,
Right.
is it? Like, I feel like it's probably up there, but like, it's just outright
Yeah.
as fact. Like, I had questions. I guess
Exactly.
touching on like the election part, you mentioned like the big social media companies.
Yeah.
I saw something within the last couple of days about like donations as well, and I think one of the things I saw, admittedly, I think this was probably a retweet from Elon Musk, suggested that like Microsoft and Google had made huge donations towards the Democrat Party, but not, and like donations towards the
I
Republican
saw
parties
that.
were minuscule in comparison. And I wonder if it's like, I imagine that is like also like a driving factor where information like that comes out, whether it's true or not, it's going to influence people in their opinions on what those platforms do or what they believe. And I guess it's with given previous stories like the eating the cats, eating the dogs, and stuff like that, and I guess President Trump's propensity to amplify that sort of messaging. It's the kind of thing where that gets weaponized very quickly against either organizations or like a particular type of group of people. And I was wondering, like,
Yeah,
how do
absolutely.
you, I guess, how do you do this at scale
Hmm.
in short terms? Like these, obviously, the results of these studies show that this works, this approach works, but how would you scale that?
Yeah, I mean that is a good question. It's I think it's one of these things that some you can't always anticipate it, but once you do, I think election, funding is obviously a critical issue. So being transparent about where funding comes from, arming people with the facts before they get false narratives. Because in the moment, even if it's debunked, and I do think that fact checking and crowdsourcing intelligence is super useful here because we do want to check those claims very fast. And the trouble is that people will then say, ah, yeah, he says that, they say this. Maybe it's true, maybe not, which is kind of a positive intervention effect in some way. But it would have been better if people had just dismissed it and said, I knew that was coming, but I've already been informed about the official. The same with Musk's sort of larger narratives, like the legacy media is just a propaganda arm of the Democratic Party and things like that. And how do people know, like, who's funding legacy media, how they work during elections? A lot of people don't know these things, so they don't have what we call the right mental defenses, so they can be manipulated in that way. Manipulated is a bit of a nasty word because nobody likes to be manipulated, but people can be influenced in that sense because they at the moment they don't have the right defenses. So how do you scale that? I mean, we've tried to scale the election rumor stuff about fraud through AI. So that was one way we're trying to show people you can actually get the AI to write those pre-bunks fast, and then scale them. Another way is that you need who's the best virtual needle. It isn't always an official organization or a scientist. Sometimes you need an influencer to disseminate the inoculation or correct information. Um, you know, an influencer that has wide reach and that has trust across the board. Because and again, it's getting more politicized, right? That who would have thought Taylor Swift would be a political sort of character, but people do get politicized. But there are and again, we're seeing all the celebrities who are now being dismissed as being part of the Democratic Party or this or that. I think, having credible sources that can talk across partisan lines. Election officials are an example, I think, who are often nonpartisan, know the rules. They're in a good spot to do the pre-bunking. Sometimes it can be judges of courts. Sometimes it can be open source intelligence community. Doctors are one of the most trusted experts, even though, again, there's some polarization here and there. But yeah, finding the right disseminator can be quite useful to scale things. And it isn't always Google, right? Some people don't trust Google, and we should be critical of social media companies. So that I think that is sort of part of the problem is that you have to find and it differs. There was a great test of inoculation for the Latino community, adaptedness to the U.S. Latino community, for example, and then you have to find the right figures in that community to engage. Religious leaders are often a great they can disseminate, for example, critical information about health, and people are much more likely in those communities to listen to their, religious or local church leaders than they are some unknown scientist or elite politician. So, yeah, I think finding the right credible sources and disseminators is a key part of scaling it. Being part of obviously of big campaigns and social media companies implementing it could help scale it, but they're not doing it at the moment. So that's a big problem.
Yeah, of course. And I guess being super biased when it comes to open source intelligence, um, how do you feel like the community could better support, like, I guess, the efforts to counter misinformation or disinformation? Is there anything in particular that you think we need
Yeah,
more of, or are there specific tools and techniques that you think are super powerful in this regard? That
I think, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
I was gonna say like super powerful techniques that fairly simple things that could be used and developed at scale to help counteract this sort of thing. And when I say that, I'm thinking organizations probably like Bellingcat who do a lot of this kind of work anyway. Admittedly, they're focusing more around like war crimes and things like that, but at doing that sort of myth busting, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few things. We're going to have Elliot, the CEO of Bellingcat, at our Cambridge Disinformation Summit next year. One of the things we're talking about is their media literacy curriculum. I'm keen for that to be evidence-based. So I think one of the things about media literacy is that there's so much of it and so many people doing stuff, but not all of it is evidence-based. And so I think actually doing evaluations, interventions, large scale trials, and so making sure that whatever we do is grounded in tested and sort of evidence-based way of doing pre-bunking or debunking, I think is critical, and not just kind of evaluating your own campaigns, I suppose, based on impressions or clicks, but actually sort of engaging with the science, I think would be great. But then in terms of what the science community could benefit from, I think, is actually the documentation of manipulation techniques that are used in certain areas. Because we often don't know, we have to spend time finding this out ourselves, of course, but we're often asked, and it makes a lot easier if we can actually have an inventory or some living resource that actually documents how frequently a particular technique is used in particular situations, like what special classes of deep fakes, or what how images are manipulated in a predictable, consistent way, or when are they most likely deployed, or what is what propaganda technique is very common during conflict, and actually, when you do this work anyway, maybe cataloging the frequency and tagging the not just whether the claim was true or false in the context, but creating an overarching category for the technique that it's a part of, and sort of cataloging all of the instances of the technique and the variants and how often that technique is used across different contexts, because that helps with being able to predict and craft inoculations in the prebunks based on repeated tropes, narratives, techniques. And there are people like Kate Starbird who try to track things in real time and document it, but I think we need much more of that in terms of tracking, documenting, and then getting the communities to talk to each other. Because we try to find some way to have real world detection systems paired up with interventions, so that interventions can be dynamic and based on real time input of what's happening in the world, and which techniques and tricks are common and how do they evolve. So I think that could be really valuable. And then, yeah, just helping with the dissemination of the practice, right? And explaining, there are ways in which you could explain it poorly and potential misuse of it. So I think, having experts in this area educate other people about evidence-based techniques that could be really valuable, I think, and sort of passing it on. So yeah, so those are um, kind of what we often need in the science community is real world examples of how this is successfully applied, because we don't typically go out in the world and do this stuff. I mean, we rely on partners who implement it. So yeah, just thinking about implementation and evaluation and how this could be scaled. And then we can often use those case studies to do more science, and that sort of symbiotic relationship. More of that would be great, I think.
No, amazing. Um, so I've got a few more questions. So the first one I've got: is our exposure to social media our greatest strength, or is it the greatest weakness in our ability to deduce what misinformation is?
Um, you mean exposure to social media in terms of whether people being on social media is a good thing in terms of their ability to discern, or whether it's a bad thing?
Yeah, is it
Yeah.
is our propensity nowadays to, obviously, clickbait is something I mentioned earlier with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, obviously, in key engagement in headlines, like, you won't believe what happened next. Oh, I have to find out.
Yeah.
Click. And then nothing happened.
Actually, that's the intro of one
So,
of one of our videos on emotional manipulation. Um, you won't believe what happens next. And then yeah, obviously there's a lot of good things about social media, but in terms of misinformation, I think it's not great, because on social media people are under time pressure, and we know from lots of experiments people make worse decisions under time pressure because you can't spend enough cognitive resources to evaluate anything at a proper level. So people share more misinformation because our cognitive resources are constrained, so we have limited bandwidth, so people make poorer choices in terms of what to share. It's also, there's immense social pressure, so there's social signals and cues attached to information, which leads people to endorse incentives that are not aligned with accuracy, but more about group identity. So it's actually not so much regular people. You can have asymptomatic spread, using the epidemiological metaphor, that a lot of people just retweet stuff and don't know that it's misinformation. But the intentional actors, yeah, they're a minority of super spreaders, and they are asymmetrically located on the right on social media, typically in clustered networks. But that doesn't mean that there's no misinformation on the left. And I think, we should be clear about that. I think Blue Anon was a great example of that, where prominent left-wing influencers were floating conspiracy theories that Trump had staged his own shooting, for example, which is, utterly ridiculous. There's also been a few voices on the left that suggested that Israel staged its own attack. And so you can get that sort of crazy stuff from the far left as well. It's just proportionally, it's a bit out of whack at the moment, and I think that has to do with what the types of candidates that and their relationship with truth, perhaps, that we're seeing at the moment.
do you think also some of that stems from I guess going back to like the 2016 election, a lot of that emanating from platforms like 4chan, and I guess the people that were populating that platform at that time were, admittedly, I think a lot of them would say they're doing it for the memes. Um, but a lot of those messages were, very hate driven in their nature. There was a lot of racial content, a lot of bigotry, and I guess a lot of that was more further right politics than it was anything else, and that's probably perpetuated ever since. Even though I guess 4chan as a platform has kind of taken a step back, I feel like in that
Sure,
regard,
yeah.
and a lot of people that were involved in that at that time have since sort of come away and gone, yeah, that was beyond what any of us ever intended.
I think it's definitely part of it, and that's also what motivated, QAnon into a whole movement. Of course, it's kind of also the comeback of the Satanic Panic from the '80s, right? There's all this stuff about Satan and pedophiles and pedophile rings being run. There were concerns on the right in the '80s about music and movies, and there was also the hysteria that people were being influenced, and some of that's returning, and so that's kind of what some people refer to as the paranoid style in American politics. And I think that was sort of disproportionately present in some right-wing echo chambers. But of course, with all the decisions now to let these super spreaders back onto the platforms, we've seen just a massive boost of it on X and elsewhere. Because confining them to their own echo chamber is not always a great idea either, in that they will just get more extreme. But there is more of a containment scenario, whereas I think now it's just everywhere because free speech and let's not regulate anything anyone says on these platforms. So I do think we've seen an explosion of some of that content. And Yeah, so I would say there is an asymmetry, um, but it is useful to keep in mind that it can happen to anyone if you're stuck in the right echo chamber.
Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I'm sure our audience is really going to enjoy this, engage with this context. It's been really fascinating. I think some really key insights into how this stuff happens, how it spreads, and also like the way you're combating it as well. I think it's really incredible. So thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure. Yeah, great conversation too. Nice meeting you, Aaron. And
You too,
be in
Sander.
touch.
Take care.
Cheers. Bye.
Before we go, I just wanted to tell you about our next upcoming events. On the 6th of November in Glasgow, we have one of our Unplugged series events coming up. This is an opportunity to listen to speakers such as Ginger T, aka CQ Core, Adam Stevenson, and Blue Corbell, aka Deadman32. That's on the 6th of November in Glasgow. Head to osint.uk/events for more information on that event and to sign up. And on the 8th of November, we have our next seminar event series, which is being headlined by Elliot Higgins, the founder of Bellingcat. We'll also have speaking Nadine Naguib, who is the managing director of Neon Century. We'll have Manisha Ganguly speaking, who is an investigations correspondent at The Guardian, and Dr. Richard Danbury, who is a senior lecturer in journalism at the City St George's University in London. That event is nearly sold out if it hasn't already by the time this video airs. So if you've not signed up, I would urge you to rapidly do that quickly. It's on Friday, the 8th of November. Thank you.